Hi, I'm Ko Nikoro, the fourth-year student at the School of Political Science and Economics, and my two friends who are presenting this topic with you today are Yuma Ando and Mitsuha Suzuki, both of them from the School of International Liberal Studies. We're going to talk to you today about the prospects of Asian globalization, and in particular we're going to be outlining several things. Firstly, we're going to bring to you what globalization in Asia is by examining the structure of globalization, and secondly, we want to talk about how there is a possibility for further integration within Asia. So let's move on without further ado to the first slide. Okay, so in order to look at what globalization actually is, we need to look at the definition of globalization. And we brought to you two definitions. One is from the Oxford English Dictionary, which says that globalization is something that is pertaining to or involving the whole world, or something that is worldwide or universal. We also have another definition from the WHO, which says that globalization is the opening of borders to increasingly fast flows of goods, services, finance, people and ideas across international borders. Of course, depending on what kind of definition you use, it differs accordingly, the definition. But obviously we see two recurring elements which are persistent in every single definition of globalization. The first is the facilitation of movement, which is initiated by as borders become lower and trade becomes easier. The second is universality, where we see a lot of integration of trade and markets. And we think that we want to base our presentation on these two pieces of definition today. So we're going to look at how this universality and facilitation of movement has affected Asia as a whole. And we're going to look at GDP because this is a form which best represents globalization and the increase in trade and development. And what you can see from this data is that out of the top 20 countries, 4 of these countries are from East Asia, which means that East Asia, at least on paper, is competitive against the West, has the ability to expand its market and has done so, and we can see that the result has been development. At least on paper, we can say that trade has greatly influenced East Asian nations, and this has led to prosperity among these countries. What we want to put our emphasis on, however, is not the fact that Asia has globalized using trade with the West and other nations. What we would rather like to look at is the effect and the structure of Asian globalization. And examining the structure makes you realize that globalization is not as simple as it first appears. So let's take a closer look at that. The aspect that we would like to concentrate on in today's presentation is that of intra-regional trade. If you compare Asia with EU and NAFTA, which are both regional trading bodies, you realize that as opposed to these two trading regions, intra-regional trade only takes up a small portion, 21% of the aggregate trade inside these Asian countries. If you look at the EU, 64% of the total amount of trade is actually done through intra-regional trade. And for NAFTA, 40% of the total amount of trade is accounted to intra-regional trade. So what does that tell us about the structure of Asian globalization? So what does the limitation of intra-regional trade tell us about the structure of Asian globalization? Well, as opposed to, for example, Europe and North America, who have formed regional trading bodies and are collectively trading and also increasing intra-regional trade, we can quite fairly say that Asian nations on the whole have acted independently on themselves without actually forming a regional trading body. They have largely been independent, forming their own trade policies without consulting other nations. And we think that this is the structure and the reality of Asian globalization. Not that of countries cooperating together to take part in the global market, but rather each country taking part by themselves to try and get a fair share of the globalization. This naturally begs the question, why aren't Asian countries uniting under a single organization or forming a collective identity? Well, simply put, we must admit that there is a lot of political distrust between the nations that we are talking about. Traditionally, Asia has had a lot of respect for national sovereignty. And also, on top of that, there are a lot of historical grievances which are left unsolved, particularly between China and Japan and Korea. Coupled with that, there are also land disputes which have been going on for 30 years. And we think that these kind of political barriers are actually creating the inability to cooperate as an Asian trading body. So yes, we can say that there is a lot of globalization of Asia, in that China, Korea, and Japan have all developed through the use of trade and therefore through the use of globalization. And we can see a lot of prosperity, particularly in the point of export. What we cannot say, though, is that there is globalization in Asia, because due to the unfortunate existence of political mistrust between these three nations, there are severe limitations on what globalization can achieve between these three countries, which, as has been shown before, is represented by the limitations of intra-Asian trade, and also by the fact that a questionnaire says that the Chinese distrust the Koreans and the Koreans distrust the Chinese. And the same can be said for Japan. So yes, there is a lot of globalization. It's just that it is not happening between these three nations. We see two possible negative consequences as a result of the inability to form a regional economic power. The first is the segmentation and fragmentation of Asia as a large market. What do we mean by that? Because the Asian nations are not able to form an economic body, they have their own standards and regulations, which means that any country wanting to do business with Japan has to do business with Japan only, because Japan has its own regulations and standards which are different to that of Korea and China. Compare that, for example, with the EU, who have set standards and set regulations for EU as a whole, meaning that a country dealing with France can also equally deal with Germany or England in much the same way. We think that this kind of decrease in the trading costs is going to be a potential boom, but this is not achieved in the current situation. The second potential harm that we see is an inability to act as an international economic body, is the lack of collective bargaining power. Japan with trade negotiations with the United States, or Korea's trade negotiations with the United States, are simply just that. They are backed by one nation, and they are not backed by a regional economic body. This severely harms and compromises the economic bargaining power of these countries, and we think that that is a huge loss in trade negotiations. So far we've seen that there is a mutual distrust among Asian nations that prohibits them from cooperating effectively. And we've also seen that this lack of cooperation leads to a loss of collective bargaining, which means that there is a lot of loss and a lack of benefit for these countries. So our next section of the presentation seeks to look at whether there is an effective solution to solve the political distrust which is so prevalent among these nations. One of the unfortunate things about the intra-Asian relationships regarding China, Japan, and Korea is that a lot of people say that it is impossible to solve, and that the enmity is too deeply rooted in history to be able to be combated effectively. But to that we say that this attitude, this negative attitude, is one of the main causes of stagnation inside the political spectrum regarding these three countries. Yes, there are a lot of enmity. Yes, there are a lot of differences, but that doesn't mean that we can just live and let live with these nations. We need more engagement, and that is why today we are very proud to propose the movement of young people in Asia as a possible solution to combat this problem of political distrust. So why are we concentrating on students and young people to change our future for us? Well, as this graph shows us, we can see an exponential increase in the amount of students who enroll in higher education. And particularly in Korea, where 90% of people are now attending university. And we are also seeing an increase in these other nations as well. Coupled with the foreseen data of an increase in the amount of students who enroll in higher education. What we also present to you is this data which shows that of the 2.7 million international students who choose to get their education abroad, 810,000 of those come from the East Asian region. This effectively tells us that a third of all international students in the world are of Asian origin. Coupled with that is the fact that of the international students who are based in the East Asia and the Pacific, 66% of those students are also of Asian origin. We believe that this increase in the number of Asian students who are traveling to other Asian countries to receive higher education is something that is effective at breaking national boundaries and also the binds of nationalism and tradition. An example of an institution that supports overseas higher education is the Erasmus project, which was started by the European Union. Since its inception in 1987, the Erasmus program has helped over 2.2 million students participate in 4,000 higher education institutions in 33 countries, as well as helping for these students to find institutions abroad. This has also helped to create a collective European identity and a sense of cohesion. We think that the same can be done in the Asian region as well. And looking through the internet, we did find an Asian equivalent to the Erasmus program. The UMAP, University Mobility in Asia and the Pacific project, started in 1998, is an effective Asian counterpart to the Erasmus program. Unfortunately for the UMAP, it has been suffering from a severe lack of budget, and an example can be seen where there was a scholarship issued by the UMAP was put on an indefinite hold in 2004. We think that this is a huge loss and hinders further engagement, but could be used to great potential if the budget were to be recovered. In order to turn the UMAP into a fully functioning body, we believe we need the help of three sectors: the government, the private, and the university. We need the government sector to make sure that it can secure the necessary visas to allow students to travel abroad and study abroad. We believe that the private sector needs to provide financial incentives and scholarships so that more and more people will be able to enroll in their programs. While we recognize that the profit for the companies might not be very high, we believe that the long-term potential of such a program would make it an extremely worthwhile investment. Lastly, we want universities to have flexibility in, for example, in credit transfer systems that make sure that students who engage in exchange programs are not set back a year after they return to their university of origin. We would also very much like them to hold inter-varsity overseas events to establish communications and connections that look outward, not just into the domestic world of Japan, but also outward towards Korea and China, like the event that is being hosted right now. We think that the three sectors working in tandem to revive the UMAP is going to establish positive relationships between the three nations. In conclusion, we believe that the mutual distrust at the bottom of Asia is preventing the globalization in Asia with several negative consequences. We think that the circulation of young students interacting abroad, having connections abroad, and establishing friendships abroad is an effective solution at dispelling these kind of negative influences. And we think that in order to better facilitate this, an investment into an educational institution that helps cross-border and overseas education is something that is worthwhile not only for educational institution itself, but also for establishing the positive relationship between these Asian three countries. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for listening.